How's everybody doing? So, welcome to the Chesapeake Forum, and appreciate having Roger Moeller come to talk to us about Operation Skyshield. I'm Doug Holly. I'm the curriculum chair for the forum, and I've been talking to Roger. Roger obviously knows a lot about aviation. I love aviation, so it's been a nice relationship that we've developed, and it's an interesting and exciting program. Something that even though I was live back then, I didn't remember it, and so it's kind of interesting to hear that. One other thing I do want to say, as the curriculum chair, always looking for ideas and other speakers. So if anybody has anybody that they know that might be an interesting program, please let me know. I'll give you a card. You can reach out to me by email or something like that. Just love to have you. But Roger, thank you very much, and take it away.
And thank you for coming all the way over from DC area.
I live in my adopted hometown of Arlington, Virginia. Thank you all for coming. I'm Roger. Some people were commenting on this photo earlier, and that is an actual member of the Ground Observer Corps, and we'll be discussing that organization a little later on. And they're set up a few blocks from the Empire State Building, which was considered the prime target for enemy attack during the Cold War in that region.
That was preset precedent.
Don't forget to turn it back on.
So, go back to the fall of the year 2000, and I was a freelance writer, and I contributed to two main customers independently, and it was a nice balance because they didn't compete with each other, and so I could pick and choose where a story might fit. Most of my work was with Aviation International News, which was the leading magazine for pilots and the trade, and I wrote technical pieces on new products, and I analyzed accidents, and I wrote about business and finance for aircraft. And also for Smithsonian, where I wrote mainly about history topics, and I also did photo research for them. And that fall, one of the editors at Smithsonian came to me. Her name was Patricia Trainer, and she said, Roger, I have a story idea for you, something that I've heard about, it might interest you. She said that sometime during the Cold War, that every airliner in the US was grounded for a defense exercise. And I said to her, and I think this is common to any so-called expert inside the Capitol Beltway, I said, well, Pat, I've never heard of that, so I think that proves it never happened. She said, well, we'll try anyway. So I did. Over the course of the next weeks and months, I found that it not only happened, but it happened 3 times. And to this day, it was the largest air exercise ever held around the world. I wrote that and submitted it in the spring of 2001. And then it sat on the desk. It was ready to be published that fall. Then in September of 2001, we had actual attacks. I lived in Arlington. That day, I went up to the roof of my building and looked directly over the Pentagon, which was about 2 miles from my house. Saw the burning and heard the reports. Got on my cell phone to this magazine, and I said, I've just finished working on Operation Skyshield. I have met contacts throughout the country and elsewhere. I'm the right guy to write the story of the national grounding that had just been ordered. So I did. So I wrote an article for Aviation International. Over the next week, I analyzed hour by hour how the airlines were grounded and how they eventually came back, and all the other aspects that were affected. Yes, ma'am.
Can you turn the volume up a little?
Yes. Let's see. Well, let's make sure it is. Did you check his mic? Was it working?
I think I forgot to turn it on.
Is the mic on now?
Oh, yeah.
I think that's what's there.
Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
I connected all the wires, just forgot to hit the on.
So I submitted that a week after this article, a week after 9/11, and with the ending that, by the way, this was not the first time they had grounded. We've had 3 before, and that was published in the next issue. And then I went back to Smithsonian and I said, oh, well, we really need to revise this. And so I did just the opposite. I rewrote the ending of that story to say, by the way, we've had 3 grounded and now we've had a 4th grounded. And between the two works, that spring I ended up getting a nice honor. I was named one of the Aviation Journalists of the Year. Would have wanted to pick up a nice award. So here's how we're going to spend our time today. We're going to start with a video that runs only 3 minutes, and that will summarize everything that we're going to cover later on this morning. Then we'll look at the air and the civil defense during the Cold War period, and we'll spend a good chunk of time there because Skyshield was the first that examined the entirety of the system at one time. All of our air defense, all of our civil defense, and evacuation plans and medical response all in one exercise. We're going to look at some questions that we still have never solved. With regard to an enemy threat, do we defend our nation or do we spend all of our efforts toward deterring an attack? Should the civilians shelter or should they be evacuated? Look at that. I'm going to look at each of these sky shields. September 10, 1960, October of 61, which was by far the largest, and again in 62. During this exercise, a B-52 bomber, which is the largest aircraft in our fleet, vanished somewhere in the Atlantic, just north of the Bermuda Triangle, actually just south of an area called the Flemish Cap, a very popular fishing spot. And officially, no trace was ever found to this day. The people running the exercise reported that it was 99% effective exercise. We'll take a look at that claim. And then the legacy. So here's my pal at the Observer Corps and a video.
Operation Skyshield was the largest air exercise in history. The first Skyshield occurred on September 10th, 1960. It tested our response to an air attack on New York, Washington, and major cities. Skyshield was repeated in October of 1961 and a third time in September of 1962. All 3 times, every airliner in North America was grounded. More than 250,000 military personnel took part, but only a handful knew its full scale. Even fewer knew its true results. Every front page ran the story requested by the White House. Then it was forgotten. Skyshield was run by the North American Air Defense Command, NORAD. Hundreds of bombers and fighter jets controlled the skies. The Army raised its missiles. Navy and Coast Guard ships and aircraft spanned 2 oceans. Most airports turned off the lights. Others opened their aircraft for tours. The White House and NORAD reassured the public that its defense was 99% effective. No other reporting was allowed.
Operation Skyshield was called nearly 100% effective by elated officials. At New York's Idlewild Airport, it was open house for visitors, as it was at many other airports. Airlines figured that today's sightseer may be tomorrow's passenger.
The 3 groundings of Skyshield faded from memory. The nationwide groundings in September 2001 were reported as the first in U.S. history.
Sounds good.
So the first Skyshield was in 1960 in the fall. The organization NORAD had just been formed 2 years earlier, so this was their first major test. NORAD is the North American Air Defense Command, and later that was changed to Aerospace Defense Command when their mission expanded. Their concept was to intercept enemy bombers in Canada. You see this graphic that was produced around 1959 with radars and our own interceptor jets to try to engage them somewhere over Canada, hopefully stop them before they reach the US border with our own intercept jets, and if not, we had missiles in all of our major cities. This was our interceptor force at the time, interceptor jets, nice pointy, and these are the official Air Force designations for the type of jet that we're seeing here, but not many people knew these numbers. People usually call them by their nicknames, which were really cool. We have the Delta Dart and the Sky Ray and the Sabre jet. This one here is the name, that's the Shooting Star. And you see that this has Royal Canadian Air Force markings on it, and the others are US Air Force, but there was also the Air Defense Command and NORAD and plenty of other forces engaged. And here are the bombers we were up against with regard to the Soviets. And again, they have designations, the Tupolev, two other brand names from the Soviets, and these were, in some cases, almost exact copies of the respective bombers in our own Air Force and in the British Air Force. And the Bear, the Bison, the Badger, and the Binder.
I like the beat word.
They like that, and those are nicknames that were assigned by NATO, and they're largely from footage that was secretly taken when Moscow would parade these almost every year during communist celebrations. So this is an illustration that was released in 1963 by the Pentagon. And it shows that year because you can argue that 63 was a turning point in our concerns about an enemy attack. Prior to that, we were most worried about a bomber with a crew in it, they call it an air-breathing threat, to come over the top of the globe and attack us from the north. But starting in 63, we see a subtle shift where most of our worries were instead about unmanned aircraft, particularly missiles. We had a defensive system that circled more than half the Earth at that time. We had radars on the Midway Islands and Hawaii. We had chains of radar systems all through the Aleutian Islands, watching for attacks launched from the Kamchatka Peninsula in Moscow. At Clear, Alaska, and two other stations, all across the top of Canada. Another station in Thule, Greenland. Stations in Iceland, and then the new space tracking station in England at Fylingdale and Moors. Over the course of a decade, it took the equivalent of more than $1 trillion to build this network. We started with this one, the Pine Tree Chain. Later on, we built the DEW line, the Distant Early Warning line, and that left gaps for different aircraft at different speeds and different altitudes, and so then we filled them in with the Mid-Canada line. Those were called gap filler radars.
Who paid for that? Was that NATO or Canada or US?
The US did, yeah. NORAD was a joint operation between Canada and the US, but by far the greatest contributor was the US.
Yeah, we had the money.
We had the
They
money.
had the land.
Yeah.
And this system was built by the largest industrial companies of that time. Largely, most of the components were by Westinghouse and AT&T and Western Electric. We also had IBM and RCA with substantial investments in equipment. And some of the fastest growth in the company's history was to build this defensive system. Then we had a network at sea that stretched as far as the Azores. And I went to see this actually a few weeks ago. It's a beautiful area. At sea, we had a different network. These three items that look like crabs are what was called Texas Towers. And they were named that because they looked like the oil rigs that we have in the Gulf of Mexico. And these were built on the continental shelf, which is the part of the ocean which is relatively shallow before it drops off into the deeper part of the ocean. And so for as much as 100 miles off the coast, the depth is no more than about 200 feet before it drops into the deep. These were built between 60 and 80 miles off the coast. The closest one to us was right here, about 63 miles off the southeast corner of Long Island.
They're still there?
We'll get to that, but this one is still there, but it's 180 feet underwater.
Whoa.
The others were dismantled. Okay. Furthermore, we had Navy pickup ships and aircraft and submarines, and along most of the East Coast, we had cables and listening devices to detect Soviet submarines. In fact, one of these was near here. It was at Cape Henlopen State Park in Delaware. They had a cable that stretched right out from there to listen for Soviet submarines nearby. And the Soviets were laying their own similar listening devices around their vulnerable spots. So that's an overview. Again, the overarching worry was an attack over the top. So let's look at these in turn in depth. I mentioned the radars. This is a typical of the installations. This is a two-leg Greenland. And to give you an idea of the scale here, that is a two-story building, and these four towers, you can see how they tower. Each one is larger than a football field on its side. And these were remote. They were not great assignments. Unless you wanted to get away from someone.
That's right.
And ships could not reach them for at least 6 months of the year.
We used to ask people if they got in trouble, what did they do to get in trouble when they had to go there?
Exactly. I mentioned that these are largely to track bomber threats from bombers, but the station that was in the north of England was for tracking space debris. And 1963 was the first time they did that. They tracked man-made objects in space. They could track objects down to 10 centimeters, which is about 2 inches, even at the time.
Wow.
In 63, they reported 357 items in space. As of 2 years ago, we had more than 36,000. And the latest estimate is between 11 and 11,500 tons now in space of debris. And those are 2 inches or above, and they end up in a catalog. If they're below that, those are much more dangerous than things like our space station. And the estimate is that particles smaller than 2 inches now number more than 130 million in space that man has put there.
Well, here's a dumb question.
Yes.
Are these items that have come off of other space vehicles of some sort, or are they being thrown up there by some countries, or?
Thanks. That's both. I'd say in more than half the cases, there were debris from peaceful missions that we put into space. In other cases, countries like the Chinese especially will intentionally test equipment by destroying satellites in space, using laser weapons. Okay, yeah, looking back here, this was the space tracking station. Going forward, we look at the Texas towers. They say these were built here. They originally planned 5, and we only had built 3 of them. All right. Off Cape Cod, off New York, New Jersey, and North Long Island. I had that backwards, sorry. Each of these had sweeping radar domes inside that were built in waters that were between 80 and 100 feet deep, except the one closest to us, which is a little bit deeper at about 120 feet deep. They were operated by the U.S. Air Force, but completely supplied by the U.S. Navy. You might see here, you see a helicopter landing, and that was the only way to supply these. And it seems like they didn't completely work through how to supply these ships when they built them. Because the helicopter ended up delivering most of the supplies, they found that ships could not do it at all. In fact, the only effective way and safe way they found eventually to take supplies from a surface ship was to have a ship moored nearby to lower the cables, to have the ship load supplies onto a smaller boat or raft, and crane the entire raft up and put it on the platform. Wow. These 3 pylons, driven into the seabed, all contain fuel oil. The one we're looking at is number 4, and the people there was a crew of 70 on the station, and they began to nickname it Old Shaky.
Old Shaky?
Yeah, because there were questions about whether that to stick into a stable part of the seabed. And also, it turns out that the radars would oscillate, and the generators would resonate with the structure, and the entire setup would shake, and they call it a shaky, kind of a bad joke. And here it is, in the fall of 1960, they took the crew from 70 down to 28 because some storms were expected. They had the Hurricane Donna hit, and it took a terrible battering. All of the men asked if they could be evacuated because the hurricane was coming. The Navy said, and the Air Force said, no, because if you abandon it, our best radars would fall into the hands of the Soviets. So they were left there to ride out Hurricane Donna. Now, the design was supposed to withstand waves up to 35 feet and Category 1 hurricane winds, and it did. It swept through. The 28 men who were on it survived. But then what happened a few months later in January of 61, a relatively mild winter storm hit, same thing. Men said, get us off here. This is going to go any second. Again, the Air Force said, no, the equipment on is too valuable.
You're not, but the equipment.
Right.
That's right. You're not, but yeah. And that mild storm, January 61, hit, and in the middle of the night, it just toppled over into the ocean, and all 28 men were killed. And I think that's, Trina asked us, is that still there? Yes, and that's still there. If you're an advanced diver, you can go down, and there's a diving map, and you can actually see it. They eventually got the secret equipment off, and it's still at the bottom of the ocean there. And now it's shifted with us at about 180 feet of the ocean.
And that's the one off Long Island?
Yes, ma'am. And you can ask questions along the way. I'll try to leave some time at the end as well.
Just repeat them maybe so that the people on Zoom can hear.
Okay. Antoinette, can you hear us fine?
Yes, I hear you fine. Thank you.
And your workers too, can they hear us? Thank you. Okay, these were patrol aircraft, and you may not recognize the shape right away because we have this radar dome on top. This was the Lockheed Constellation, and their nickname was Connies, and it was one of the most popular kinds of passenger aircraft because it was considered so smooth and fast relative to other airliners of the day. But this was the standard fuselage of a civilian airliner, just converted to Navy use with reinforced, with bunk beds and a galley in the back and a crew. And they were equipped with longer range tanks. And most of these were based in Newfoundland. And they would fly patrols up and down the East Coast, and they were staggered for missions up to 12 hours, and they were staggered so that at all times, 24 hours, there was at least one of these patrolling the East Coast of the US. The Navy called them Morning Stars. For those of you who like the nomenclature, those were EC-121s.
Predecessors of EC3.
Exactly. A little further out, we had the Navy blimps. Now, if there was something going on that posed a larger threat, a little longer than temporary, the Navy would send out a blimp and just kind of park in the sky for a couple of days at a time. This was the model ZPG-2W. So it matters. This is an actual photo from 1961. This is a cutaway illustration to give you an idea of the scale. Hidden inside the envelope of this blimp was a rotating radar with a 40-foot diameter.
Wow.
This control car is 83 feet long and 2 stories high. And say they could just fuel up and go out and find a relatively safe place to park, account for the winds aloft, and just stay there for 2.5 days. Just watch our activities. These were non-rigid. That means that their shape held only because of the pressure of the helium inside. They had about 1.5 million cubic feet of helium. Okay. Inland, we had a place where all of these assets were reporting to us. This was the SAGE system, the semi-automatic ground environment. Here's an operator over here. So we have the Texas Towers, the picket ships, the warning stars, and the interceptors, all feeding information from outside around the border of the US into these bunkers. And we had 23 of these. The nearest one to us was in South Coburg, New Jersey. They were largely built by MIT. These had concrete walls that were 1.5 feet thick in a theory to withstand a nuclear blast. They had the largest computers ever built in terms of physical size. The computer in there had 49,000 vacuum tubes and it weighed 250 tons.
Probably have the power of our phones today.
So the computer weighed 500,000 pounds, and this laptop computer is far more powerful and faster. The only way they could meet the requirements for reliability, though, was to install 2 of them. One was on hot standby all the time. So 1 million pounds of computer equipment. So this guy at the console, does anyone know what he has in his hand? Ever seen one of those?
Light sensor.
Exactly. We were a light sensor. At the time, we used that method to communicate with the computer rather than using a cursor or a click today. And the sensor inside the cathode ray tube would read the flash of the light gun. And you can use that to point it and mark a target and then track it.
Oh.
Well, here's my buddy at the Empire State Building. And 2 women manned that post. This was roughly at East 30th Street. And they had aircraft spotting signals. And the idea was that they would phone in a report of an aircraft to what's called a filter center, which would then determine if it was friendly or not based on a list they had. The thing is, if the first time that you see an aircraft is when it's already over your city, you don't have many options. This organization, Ground Observer Corps, was formed in World War II, but they maintained their numbers right through the end of the Cold War. In fact, were not dismantled right up until the time that the SAGE centers that were just overactivated. So right up until the end of '58. At its peak, there were 16,000 people volunteering to man these 24 hours.
It was voluntary.
It's all volunteer, it was entirely volunteer. It includes right here in Talbot County. This unit was formed in wartime. This was Talbot Post number 70 of the Ground Observer Corps. Throughout Talbot County, the idea was a standard. They were shooting for 8 posts for every 1,000 square miles to watch for enemy aircraft. We had them at Island Creek, Barber, Peach Blossom, only a few blocks from here, McDaniel, Longwood, Royal Oak, Tunis Mills.
I have a question.
Sorry, I was zooming in.
Yes, ma'am.
I had 2 friends now, both of them lived into their 90s that were part of this, I think they were in high school or something during World War II. And they were both part of this watching, and they had the charts on the walls to identify the aircraft and all that. But I remember one of them saying, nobody ever told us what to do if we spotted one.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's tough. The idea was to get on your rotary dial phone, call the filter center, and say, oh, we just saw an aircraft. Oh, it's gone now. All right. So by the time it took to respond to that, determine if it was friendly, you say you're out of options. That was the idea anyway.
So a way to make the civilians feel important.
Part of the.
Yes, there was.
So we kept them trained, and throughout the 1950s, yes, sir.
Any idea how many actual reports were ever made?
Those were tracked, and I don't have the actual numbers, but they had statistics, and they determined that between 85 and 90% of the reports were not for actual enemy aircraft. It was simply for aircraft that didn't file a flight plan, or they deviated from where they were intended to fly, they got off course from the airport, things like that. But I don't have the actual volume.
Yeah.
Was there another question?
No, I was just pointing out.
To keep them trained, we would have regular drills throughout the 1950s, including right from Easton Airport. There were at least 8 of these throughout the 50s that were run from the Easton Airport, and the first one was in November of 51. And another aircraft took off here to join a fleet of 54 private aircraft, and they flew all over Dorchester and Talbot and the adjoining counties so that spotters could try to pick them out. And of course,
Was it part of the Civil Air Patrol?
yes, sir.
Wasn't that like the beginnings of the Civil Air Patrol?
Yeah, it was a predecessor. Thank you. And I point out that the group that organized a lot of these people was called the Office of Civil Defense Mobilization, OCDM, and they were predecessor to Homeland Security. So in our cities, as the last line of defense, we had missiles, and they were everywhere, and our intent was to make them quite visible, not only to the Soviets, so they knew that there were missiles waiting for them, but to our own public to reassure them that their tax dollars were being spent to guard them. And this is typical. This is right on the Chicago lakefront with fancy apartment buildings right behind. Here is downtown Chicago. The Sears Tower is right there. And look at all the stations that were just around Chicago at the time. This is in January of 61, right in the center of these exercises.
They were just outside of New York. I remember as a kid riding into New York on Northern State Parkway, Grand Central Parkway, and you'd go by and you'd see. Originally, they were, before the missiles, they had anti-aircraft guns. And then when missiles came in, they changed the guns over to missiles.
They were sharing that. Yeah, and they were in the Florida Keys as well, and on both coasts. And we have a major city, as I said, and they would drill constantly and make sure that the public could see them drilling constantly. Say, see, we're doing our job to protect you. Here it is out in San Francisco. They're all through the neighborhoods and the hills around San Francisco, but again, right on the water. There's one on a mobile platform right on the waterfront to guard the bridge. And this is now a state park. I was out there a few years ago, and these stands are still there. Of course, the missiles are gone. But you can visit the state park to see where the missiles used to be to guard that city. Has anyone been there? It's a fun trip. Yeah. And of course, we still use those today. They're just not as public, not as obvious. This is the new executive office building, about a block and a half from the White House. And these are called the Avenger missiles, and they're easy to find. Again, they're not hidden. Just check Google Maps. This corner of the building, right along 17th Street, is a missile battery.
So what's left today, since I used to walk past that all the time? Is any of that stuff still up there?
It's still there. If you walk there, walk through there tomorrow, you can actually, if you know, now you know it's there, you can find this angle, stand on the street, and you can just see it. And no one around you, except you, will know that those are missiles. And now you know the shape, I'm sure you can.
Most of the underground missile sites are still around.
So are they operational still
They're
today?
operational, yeah. They're ready to go at any time.
Close to the White House.
So we wanted to let people know what was going on. So starting in the early 1950s, the idea was a campaign to let civilians know to prepare and to expect trouble. This was part of Alert America, essentially a campaign that scared the socks off everyone. Very dramatic posters. Civilians were the #1 enemy target. This one, civilians can be bombed. If you can't read this headline, this was of 1951. 70 of 100 enemy bombers can get through, according to the U.S. Air Force. And the U.S. Air Force at the time admitted that 7 of 10, at a minimum, of the enemy will get through regardless of our $1 trillion system.
Oh. But it was 99% successful.
So early on, the idea was to tell people that.
What it would be in the year 2024.
So you got a tough balance. You have the Air Force accidentally telling the truth. But later on, at the same time, wanted to reassure the people that their money was worthwhile and they didn't have to hide under the desk. So what do you really tell the people? So we had convoys and free programs to alert America in the early 50s. And we have largely women volunteers who visit the schools and local centers and bring kids in for the day. We had the Alert America convoy of trucks to set up these exhibits on fallout shelters and surviving radiation and stuff. And usually we're done with pretty women. Can't beat that.
Was it true that the #1 target would be civilians?
At the time, the targeting was not real precise, and they were likely to be airburst, and they were at roughly 1,200 feet above ground level, and so it would be a lot of civilians affected. This was typical, and this is actually right in the eastern area. So we had a campaign to purchase these vehicles. They were called Calamity Janes in the early 50s. And the federal government bought them with tax money, and then they sold them to local counties, including Talbot, on the cheap. So the taxpayers in general subsidized the cities. This is Miss Maryland. She's having a great old time. She's Miss Maryland 1954 on a tour through Easton and Cambridge, where this photo was taken.
So what was in the trailer?
Radiation dose meters and equipment to treat radiation burns, and for people with lost vision due to atomic flashes, and also all kinds of digging equipment to get people out of blast damage. So it was never used for a nuclear attack, luckily, but they were everywhere. There were at least 4 of them on the eastern shore. The only time it was used nearby was in Chestertown. Anyone people know the Chestertown area? In July of '54, the Kent Manufacturing Company, which made fireworks and munitions, had a massive explosion, and 13 workers were killed. And a lot of people were nervous at the time because just moments before the explosion, a jet aircraft had fallen over, and people were not used to jet aircraft noise in 1954. Would have had nothing to do with it. But most of the people had to evacuate by walking over the Chester River Bridge. But this very truck responded. Any of you ever seen these before?
No, no.
So the government started putting out literature like this through the government printing office to look at tiers of response. Of course, if you have no warning that the A-bomb was coming, get down and shield yourself
1 minute.
in a door, drop to the floor, etc. Did anyone go through drills in school?
Oh, yeah.
Under your desk.
Yeah,
You sit
in the hallway.
We lined up in the hallway.
Yeah, that's what we did.
I lived in an apartment house in Brooklyn, New York, and there was a bar, bar shop. And I once went in it, and there was all kinds of stuff. There were water containers, there were drugs, like aspirin and stuff like that, in big bottles, you know?
Right.
So it's just like a central thing there. They had those right up,
Dosimeter.
those, yeah.
My middle school was a
Yes, I forget whether it was the New York Daily Mirror or the New York Daily News, but they would print up every now and then, it'd be on the front page, an outline of Manhattan, the X over the Empire State Building and concentric rings. And as the bombs got bigger, the map got smaller and the rings got larger. And eventually somebody said, well, what happens if they bomb Flushing instead? Because they missed the hill. We're toast. So then it stopped.
All right, good. These posters were everywhere in schools to know there were signals. The idea was if you heard a steady blast, less than 3 to 5 minutes, that was the highest level of alert. Okay? And there were different ones that the kids were expected to memorize. And this looks kind of amateurish and silly, but these were official posters of the OCPM issued at the time. Here's the warning siren for Easton. It's across from the Econo Lodge on Route 50, a few miles from here. These models were all designed in the 1950s, and the technology has not been updated ever since. This one is actually newer, but this is a model of federal code or federal electric code with regard to how loud they need to be, how they operate, how reliable.
Do they ever test them?
They do test them, but they're, of course, now for storms.
Is that where the Royal Farms is just been put in? No.
That's the one.
No, Royal Farms
Next to Walgreens.
Well, there is some sign that goes up there every time there's a big fire.
Oh,
That's Walgreens.
So if we had an enemy attack, this is your signal. And you need to know, and these are the codes that we still use 60, 70 years later on.
What do they know about?
And the idea is, at the time, when you heard the siren, you were supposed to turn off your television and switch from the radio station you were on to these two stations instead, 640 or 1240 on the dial. This was part of the CONORAD system, the Continental Alert Radio System. They sell radios that were already tuned to those two frequencies on the AM dial. Or you can get stickers, CD stickers to put on your car radio to remind you that 640 and 1240 with the emergency broadcast network at the time. Of course, now we do that by smartphones. Occasionally, the White House will send out an emergency alert nationwide by smartphone. So, any monitor approach, take everything, all the other electronics down, and turn the radio on, take the radio into the shelter with you. And they still recommend carrying an AM band radio with you in today's shelters, believe it or not.
Yeah,
Because your cell phone battery may only last
right.
2 days at the very best. A small crank radio. Why do we do that? Because at the time, the enemy bombers would use signals from our radio stations, especially in the AM band, to find their target.
Low frequency navigation.
And for that reason, in all cities, the tallest, most prominent building was usually where all the AM broadcast antenna were kept. And that is what made them the prime target. In New York City, that was the Empire State Building. And people think today, the enemy wants to bomb something like the World Trade Center because it's prominent and it's a financial center and it's symbolism. But at the time, the word was because of the AM radio signal. The Conorat system, they would diffuse the threat by picking 3 or 4 stations in the region. All of the signals that would reach your house, and they would bounce the signal, so only any one station was only broadcasting for a few seconds at a time, so that enemy couldn't get a fix on any one of them. Follow what I'm saying?
Right.
My adopted town of Arlington, they moved theirs underground, near where some of the county water supply comes, and they had a fallout shelter so they could keep broadcasting during the nuclear attack. And they moved all their corporate offices to the nicer part of town. So it's just the engineer and the DJ working in that, in the underground shelter. If all else failed, this is a test just outside of Philadelphia. Guy with a bullhorn going around.
Where's Hunter when we need him?
They also had a number of school buses that were converted to emergency communication devices. They had pay phones with rotary dial on the school bus and connect to a local hookup. So we kind of realized that we got to start telling people to build their own fallout shelters because we're not sure that the U.S. government will protect us. In Arlington at the time, as of early 60s, they had about 180,000 people in the permanent population, and most counties look at permanent versus those who commuted in for work or school. And we had shelters for 60,000, so about a third, which is much higher than the average. Right. So there was discussion in Congress and local governments, how do you get people to put a fallout shelter in their house to compensate for what the federal feds are not doing? It's part of the shelter tour, by the way. The OCDM recommends you have at least 3 feet of earth over you. And walls at least 1 brick wide, right? And equipped, and that the guidelines for food and water still apply today, at least 1 gallon of water per person per day, plus food. And you need to assume that there will be no electricity or light in the shelter. And you should have your radio with you. And it should be well ventilated. This was an actual model that toured throughout our region. They're equipped like this. Of course, they started with the biscuits, civil defense biscuits, and these were basically hardtack, which was used since Civil War days. And a hardtack biscuit will last for decades, still edible, just flour, salt, and water. And these came, there were 89 biscuits per pound, built 62, and if you could open that box today, it would still be edible, I'm sure, it was stored right. Sanitation kits, the MK4. This was toilet needs for up to 50 people, including bending this and using this as the actual toilet. And it's filled with toilet paper and hygiene supplies and a siphon. I'm not going to get into how that's.
You run out of hot.
They have big water containers too.
And water containers, exactly. And right in our area. So this was over at the Y River Plantation, which is now the Aspen Institute. They had in the basement these 2 big blast doors and a shelter for 50 people, which is the family and all the ground staff. And they all had suitcases in there. And they had enough supplies for several months, food, medical, and they had 5,000 gallons of drinking water. And that shelter is still there, but it's just used for storing records right now. But these are just men.
You said a part of the specification was well ventilated. Wouldn't ventilation be letting radiation in?
There were specs that you could get quite easily at the time, and the government printing all this distributed, but there was ways to design the vent so that in theory, that all the air was taken in from under a hood and would go through a filter, and in theory, that was supposed to keep you.
In theory. That's a little scary.
The largest, and that held just the 50 people locally, but actually the largest one in this area was in Cambridge. It used to be called the Eastern Shore Medical Center. It was a psychiatric hospital, and they had room for several thousand in their tunnels underneath. This is now, that's long gone, this is now a Hyatt Regency resort in Los
Why would they have tunnels underneath?
to connect the buildings, to use them all year round, and
Why
supplies,
is that? Oh,
and
interesting.
the heating equipment's down there.
All big government facilities are connected.
And of course, right up the street, the Talbot Bank, their shelter held 125 people. We distribute these by the tens of millions. These are book covers reminding kids about the alert signals.
Huh.
Now I'm jealous. My mom had us make book covers out of brown paper bag. This is so cool. I never got one. Government printing office initially put out 10 million of these brochures on fallout protection. They want you to read them. And they actually held a kind of contest around cities. They give them the post office and they mandate the post office track how many were picked up. Around Washington, it was kind of it kind of got kind of sporting. Arlington was leading the pack. They'd given 12,500. They picked up 10,000 of them. So we're in the back. Government printing office said we don't care if we're reading them or not. In our budget, we need to print 25 million more, and they did. So I would say tens of millions of various kinds of fallout shelter and blast protection ideas. Plus a billboard campaign paid for by U.S. taxpayers. This one is right by the Space Needle. And most cities will tell you how to get to the nearest shelter. This was the plan for my town. This is a few blocks where I am. They said there were 203 shelters just around Arlington. And there's probably a map like this for Easton. This is probably typical, fun story from that time, Montgomery County, suburb of Washington. The guy wanted to build his own shelter. He called up the building code people for Montgomery County, said, hey, I want to build this at night so my neighbors don't know I'm doing it. Is that okay? And building code inspector said, well, that's fine with us, nothing against that. And for whatever reason, the building code guy then ratted them out, went to the local paper, and here it is. So,
Say where it is.
I'm not gonna say, well, if you built a shelter, would you keep it quiet? And would you even ask the county if it's okay?
Today, nobody would.
I have a friend who has been canning food, and she says, I'm not telling anybody that I've got enough food for, X amount of time.
There was a Twilight Zone episode about that.
I like looking at the real estate ads, and usually you can often find them in Washington area still listed as a feature of the house, and a lot of them have been turned into wine shops, wine cellars.
Good use. Get bombs.
Get
So the plan was to make these affordable for everyone, and so the district and the national level Congress debated what kind of tax deduction for building a shelter. Standard 8x10, used exclusively for fallout protection, can't use as an office or as a guest room. Right? And it's right in the Maryland tax code as well. Actually, in the run-up to Skyshield 2, we had the Maryland governor as J. Miller Toss at the time. And they had all the publicity for Skyshield coming up, and he proposed that the cost of a shelter or construction could be deducted from your taxes. Okay. And around the country, a lot of jurisdictions adopted these, and they're still available. They're still in tax code. This is Dorchester County, and it's still explicitly defines a fallout shelter as a home improvement. In DC area, they started warning you, said, well, they're going to get through anyway, the bombs. So they adopted this standard, which is a 20-mile circle from the most likely target. In Washington area, that would be the Washington Monument, and roughly a 20-mile circle. And today, FEMA, the Emergency Management Agency, still uses 20 miles as standard, and these were evacuation zones.
I always wondered when they talk about evacuation, where are you gonna go?
Good question.
Away from us.
Further than 20 miles.
Yeah, and of course, the citizens out there are gonna just love all these residents coming from New York and Washington in their neighborhood.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's a great question. Question of where do you go? And no one really knew. Most citizens outside of the government that made these plans knew where to go. And test after test shows the same thing, that when you drill for these, or an actual emergency, people don't go where they're supposed to go. They go home. Because they want to be with people that they care about, or they want to just get their valuables. And so an evacuation ends up looking just like a regular commuting day, just faster. And the thing for sure, this place for often, this was, imagine, when the bomb goes off, don't be there.
Just snap your fingers and be somewhere else.
So we had testers, I think one of us, Jim, knew about this exercise, because the biggest one, I say there were at least a dozen of these throughout the 50s, so by the time we got the Skyshield, people say, oh, it's just another test. All right? This was 55, and here is a photo of people running out of the Pentagon. And they actually timed how long it took from the time the siren was sounded to how long it took to reach their car. And 15,000 government workers were brought to several hundred undisclosed spots around the Washington area and stayed there. And they wanted housewives to pack a lunch and find a picnic area and keep the kids there for 2 hours.
There's a picture of New York, of Times Square in New York during one of those, totally empty. During, I think that was the one in 56, where they had one of these massive drills and they forced everybody off the streets. And there's nobody in Times Square, there's nobody on the bridges. And that was the last time they tried that. After a while, New York, I said, forget it.
I know the picture he's talking about, quite eerie. You know, so just look up Operational Word, that was the biggest one, let's say there were lots of them. And say by the time we got to the early 60s, people were so used to it, they said, oh, just another test. And they just didn't pay attention anymore. So in the Washington area, they were ambitious. They said we can get 650,000 people out of the city in a few hours. I don't know if that's realistic. This was per Virginia Survival Plan, and it's the same thing for Maryland, and there's one for Eastern Shore Evacuation Plan. Now, broadly, when you look at these kind of plans, there are two kinds of zones for evacuation. You have the evacuation zone, and then you have the reception zone. If you're in the evacuation zone, it's kind of the implication that you're important enough that the enemy wants to knock you out. You're in the reception zone, that's where everyone in the evacuation zone is going. It's odd, you get to, there's a kind of prestige, as the one, that you're important enough to be bombed, right? I was in Arlington, which is kind of half and half, but almost the entirety of the district considered itself so important that they were an evacuation zone. All the Maryland suburbs, and especially the side of the Bay Bridge, were all reception areas. And so you look back in historic archives, you can find, pick a town and find what the reception area plan is. So how can you really get things out? This is an aerial photo in the late 1950s of National Airport. They had to figure logistically how do you get all these 650,000 people out of town. Here's the area of the airport from standing over the runway. This is the old airport drive-in theater. Anyone know the Arlington area? Yeah, and that was one of many tests that went into the calculations for evacuation plans. They looked at the end of the movie and how long it took to get all the parked cars out of the drive-in movie parking lot. As a proxy for evacuating Washington. This was Route 395. Anyone used to commute on that? This was in 1960, which is about 7 years after it opened, and it's it's already well over capacity. Jams up every rush hour. And these were evacuation zones for Arlington. There's one for here too. Around the Pentagon for sure, the airport. And the idea was that people in these neighborhoods were supposed to know where they were expected to go and get there. But in actual emergencies, they don't go there, they go home, as I said, because they want things that are important to them. And so people say, I didn't know about it in the first place, but either way, I'm not following this plan.
Does it occur to anybody if you said the Eastern Shore would be a reception zone?
Yes.
At this point,
There was no bridge.
one two-lane bridge.
Right.
Can you imagine the backup? They backed up clear to DC.
Well, funny you should mention that. Let's have a look. What you're talking about? The Chesapeake Bay Bridge here being constructed didn't open until mid-1952.
52.
This was the only way across the bridge in the time from Sandy Point to Mattapique. The ferry. Here's a car ferries. This is in 1951. And across. Yeah. And
Even after it opened, then the ferry stopped.
and
And the two-lane bridge.
well, it went into, I have some statistics here. When it opened, it was designed to carry 1,500 vehicles each direction per hour, or 8.5 million vehicles per year. Last year, we had 23 million crossings.
Whoa.
Usually at the same time I'm trying to cross the bridge. We saw the Washington plan. The planner said that 395 and local highways on average could take 1,000 cars per lane per hour. Does that sound realistic to you? No. You don't know where you're going in the first place, and then there's panic, and there's people acting like Washington drivers. So, of course, you can't use the Bay Bridge Tunnel. It's closed as any emergency, especially storms. That's closed off. So the alternative became, well, what about water? If we can't use, we could use the Bay Bridge, but that's going to be overloaded almost instantly. And what if you lose a bridge? Currently, we're down one bridge in Baltimore right now, for example. So that's not even an option. And there are constant reports by the communities in between here in DC saying, well, our roads aren't in a condition to handle any kind of traffic, let alone 1,000 per lane per hour. So there was a test of the Chesapeake as an evacuation plan. And so what they did is they did any number of tests throughout the shore. One of the bigger ones in 53 and then 55 and 56 and later in 66. All in the Chesapeake, they would sound all the air raid sirens and then have boats practice bringing people away from Baltimore toward this reception area, which was nice and safe. All right, at the time, early 60s, there were 26,000 boats around the Chesapeake Bay. They don't have an exact figure now, except in Maryland now, there are about 169,000 boats registered. And they did all sorts of incentives for boat captains to volunteer their boat back to be an evacuation craft. Say this is a typical of an alert just before Skyshield. People said, another alert, I'm not going to go, I'm not going to bother. When you hear the siren, you're supposed to pull off the road, or you're supposed to try walking to your shelter, and almost no one did. All the suburbs of Washington said, at best, 1 in 50 cars pulled off to the side. Everyone else just said, no. So too many chicken littles. So, in comes time for Skyshield. To people ignoring that, let's test all of these. So we bring in a simple figure in this is Najib Halabi as the second administrator of the FAA. At the time, it was Federal Aviation Agency. It wasn't Federal Aviation Administration 2 years later under the Transportation Department. And here he is being introduced to Washington on the society page, which kind of speaks to the glamour of aviation at the time. Good buddy of JFK, really captured the idea of a qualified person running an agency at the time. The hiring used to be on merit.
Thank you for that phrase, used to be.
He from a wealthy family in Dallas. the Halibys. They ran the antique and rug business at Neiman Marcus. And he took this office, block away from the White House on New York Avenue, and he decorated all the antiques from his family's antique store. He was Syrian Lebanese descent. This desk was well known, very valuable desk. And when I interviewed him, he confirmed what I heard, that his daughter, Lisa, used to play on the desk all the time, including during Skyshield. His daughter, Lisa Halaby, anyone know why that name is famous?
She married somebody in the Middle East.
Right.
Halaby.
Jeeb was asked by King Hussein of Jordan to come set up a training academy in the Middle East. He took his daughter with him. She met the king.
Yeah.
And eventually became his fourth wife. And so she is famous in her own right. So here's Halaby, classic. He had flown every aircraft in both the Air Force and Navy fleet. And many of the airliners who he was thoroughly familiar, quite capable. So young, tall, and handsome, very much the opening of Dulles Airport and meeting Kennedy toward the people. And a beautiful wife, and he was in his mid-40s. Well, he took the great office during Skyshield. He was still set up along with all these other groups right on the National Mall. Most of these were built in World War I and then later expanded in World War II. There's a reflecting pool. The FAA was right here, 300 feet from the Washington Monument. This crowd is the March on Washington in 1963. And they were still there. Before it was FAA, it was CAA for Aeronautics Administration. And they changed it to FAA.
So those buildings were on the Washington Monument in the city.
Right? Some of them were built in 1918, temporary for World War I, and the last one was not taken down until 1971.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh,
So here it is at the
I
height.
thought there were never buildings there. I didn't know that.
Temporary, quote, air quote, on both sides. And at one point, there was so much traffic from office workers that they had footbridges heated across the reflecting pool.
Oh my gosh.
Over here were all dorms for women war workers. And over here, which is now Potomac, East and West Potomac Park, were all dormitories as well. And here again is the March on Washington, temporaries on both sides, and FAA during Skyshield is right there. So he wanted to solve the problem of getting people to run this thing properly. He introduced the Federal Aviation Service. The idea was that in an emergency, a federal employee at the FAA could instantly be drafted and become a member of the armed services of the U.S., subject to the Military Code of Justice, and report to him. And they even designed uniforms to make that a possibility. And surprisingly, he got a lot of support. A lot of people at that time in senior position had served in World War II or Korea. And they were quite supportive of the military, but still this was too far. In the end, they didn't implement it because they couldn't agree on how to mesh the two retirement systems. Okay. That was me. He wanted that power. So it's time to prepare for Skyshield, starting about 6 months out. Massive amounts of paper. Started with these maps. The idea was to launch from almost every air base in the US, fly out over the ocean on either side, or into Canada, or into the Gulf, and then come back and attack, pretend attack a US city. And so we have many of these kind of charts that find the zigzag pattern. This is an altitude reservation plan to make sure that everyone goes on the expected path. And you see a lot of aviation gibberish here, but I can translate that later on if you want. I mean, tell the exact time to enter Canada and went back, and the flight levels. These numbers say 1744Z. Z is Zulu time, that's Greenwich Mean Time, and lots of other things. This one happens to be from Oklahoma. And and each group was 2 sets of 3 aircraft. It would be 2 B-52 bombers and 1 tanker to refuel them, called a KC-135 straddle tanker. Starting about between 4 and 3.5 months ahead, everyone in the U.S. knew this was coming. Here it is closer to the exercise, New York Times. All the bases warned that people were going to hear sonic booms because our fighters going to go supersonic, and they did. The warnings didn't help. People said, "What is this?" All the railroads, including Amtrak, put on extra capacity because all the airlines would be down. And Greyhound and Trailways all put on extra buses, especially between DC and Baltimore.
Amtrak didn't exist until the 80s.
Yep, wherever Amtrak was at the time, yeah.
Private
Yeah.
railroads.
But they still all agreed, there's very high support for the military and these kind of exercises, because everyone was scared into complying. And again, here it is, the greatest suspension of air traffic in history. Pilots were reminded through a group called AOPA, Aircraft Owners and Pilots, that even as a private pilot, you cannot fly that thing. It was 3 times. The airline said, well, everything's going to be closed, let's turn this to our advantage. And so they took advantage of the public's fascination with aircraft, because at that time, relatively few adults had flown, I mean, compared to today's numbers. It was for businessmen and for wealthy people. And so they held open houses throughout the groundings. They would go onto the airplanes to try airplane food.
Good back then.
I was gonna say, it was bad.
At least they got food.
And the airports reported they had the highest traffic they'd ever seen, far more than a regular flying day, because people just wanted to see the airplanes. And just prior before this, they started to introduce the first jet aircraft for passenger airplanes. So people had never been on an airliner, let alone a jet aircraft, and really wanted to see it. And a lot of airlines held their conferences or did maintenance because none of their competitors were flying, so why not? There was even a special deal that you could fly out to Hawaii just before the exercise and then get a cruise back.
That's fine.
And how long were they down for?
First time less than a day, the third time less than a day, but then over the weekend in October '61. The actual grounds in 2001 were about 2.5 days. So Easton started to get ready. So that's all the major airports were doing. Easton too. This is a photo from this was wartime. This was actually well into the Cold War. This is what's called the Hecht Brothers Building. Here's Courthouse Square downtown. They don't recognize this area. And this was under a program that we used to call earmarking. And if you want, I can send you an article on that. Starting in the 20s, it lasted almost 30 years. The federal government would supply paint and materials, and the town would supply volunteers, and you could mark your town. And the Bureau of Air Commerce used to make maps, and they nudged people to do this. They said, air marking literally puts you on the map. What I meant by that is they will not even list your town on the map until you painted its name.
Huh. At the time, navigation was really good tile.
Really into tile, and actually, and this was taken in, I think, in '41. There was talk of removing all of these during World War II, so the enemy could not use it. Then they said, well, all of our own student pilots can't find their own way around, so they kept them there. The Easton Airport, they were kind of closed anyway, didn't really notice it, but this is, as of the mid-1950s and a few years, they only had 2 scheduled flights per day. And in all of the late 50s, they carried fewer than 800 passengers a year. An average of 1.5 passengers per flight. So they made all the money from airmail and cargo. This is the busiest the Easton Airport had ever been in 15 years prior to Skyshield. This was September '60, and this aircraft is a Constellation. and they had 10 of them there, but they were grounded all year because they were part of an airline called Capital in DC, and that was converting to jet aircraft. So they flew them all out from National, parked them in Easton until they were sold.
Did the company get picked off at Easton Airport?
Yes, sir. If it, I don't know, take off, if it land there. But, so not much going on in Easton, but this is typical. This is at Idlewild Airport, it's now JFK Airport. And people said, I want to see that constellation or the jet. At Los Angeles, they had immense crowds. Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta had overfull crowds. All the highways around just absolutely jammed. People wanted to see these airplanes. I got plenty more of these in the airport. I probably have a photo of it. Yep. Meanwhile, at National Airport, here it is, the height of normal rush hour, but there's no one in there except cleaning staff. NORAD, the Air Force, sent their own sergeants in to take over the control tower while the civilians were kicked out. It was Andrews Air Force Base, and some of the nice pointy jets they talked about, Sabre Jet and the Delta Dart, and that's a Scott Ray and F-14. And this was happening all over the US. At the same time, our allies held their own mirror exercise. This is in Britain, and I've been in one of these. It's really jumping. And so they went down into these bunkers, and they simulated a nuclear attack on Great Britain. And every few hours, they were given sheets to pretend where the forces were and the level of the atomic strike. And I've interviewed some of these old guys, and they said what a great time these were, you know, kind of playing poker and drinking all weekend. They probably thought it a pretty unpleasant way to spend the weekend. They asked me these things where the air was terrible and then they smelled. But this is, if you can't read the French, this is 66 fictitious bombs falling in Great Britain. This is actual scrambling for the jet to intercept the pretend bombers coming in at Royal Canadian Air Force Base. So we not only had simulated bombers, we put out saboteurs to go through the woods and attack the Royal Canadian bases by ground. And it's tried in some cities around Air Force bases as well as here they penetrate the fences around Air Force bases. Around most cities, we also did disaster relief. This is in the Washington area. In a lot of cases, these were sons and daughters of people who worked as civil defense volunteers, and they're brought into area hospitals during Skyshield with radiation burns and with fake injuries. At the time, they used real blood called goulash to make the injuries that much more realistic.
Not ketchup, huh?
Not ketchup, goulash.
Oh, no.
And it's typical of the routes. So you fly out to neutral places in the ocean or near the edge of the Arctic Circle, come in and attack a city or an airbase. And this is duplicated figure in almost every state. At the height of the exercise, Skyshield 2, Radio Moscow put a broadcast to London to say, look, this exercise proves that negotiations are futile. There can be no peaceful settlement. The shadow of atomic death looms over the present generation. A lot of people protested in London, anti-nuclear protesters, and one protester / terrorist group took over a radio station to broadcast kind of peace messages, so to speak. This is front page coverage on almost all major newspapers, and the very newspapers were the ones in 2001 said it never happened before. Same groups. 99% effective. 0.9. 99.9.
Yeah.
And I checked the time codes on the originals, and these were literally written before the exercise started.
So did the newspapers mean that 9/11 was the first time it was ever actually implemented in a real world situation versus and exercise.
It's possible, if you give them credit for knowing that, it's possible that's what they understand.
I mean,
No, because they said grounded. They didn't differentiate.
well, obviously 9/11 was not exercise.
That's
At least
right.
most people believe that. But
So what do you think, how many people say intentional,
Intentional that they,
they admitted the earlier ones, or just didn't know?
they
I
didn't
don't
know.
think they do.
They're younger than we are.
Yeah, they don't look in their
yeah, I don't
files.
think it was an intentional.
They don't know history.
Well, 9/11, one of the big problems was there was no communication between the FAA and military.
Exactly.
I mean, there's a lot of things that went, just went wrong.
In contrast, people lined up in Idlewild, but at the same time, you have people over space, peace and being there.
They had a weekend without.
Unless you were being invaded by those Air Force planes that were trying to see if they could get through.
You live under a flight path, Skyshield is great news for you. Okay. The bombers were flying in groups of 3, they say 2 bombers and a tanker. And this particular one left from North Carolina, went to Newfoundland. And was supposed to go south of the ocean and come in and attack Pittsburgh. They refueled about a half hour earlier than it was supposed to. No one ever explained why that is. They were in radio silence, which was required. They were on a 30 nautical mile front, so it was 3 of them, one here, 115 miles, and 115 miles laterally, and they were supposed to fly 1,000 feet, but most of them flew lower than that, over the Atlantic. Weather was really tricky in that area. I'd say it's over what's called the Flemish Cat, and it's, I think it's more than one movie talks about how dangerous the weather quickly turns in that area.
That's B-52, you said.
B-52, yeah. And this is an actual flight plan from the lost bomber, B-52G model, and tells their fuel load and the traffic you're talking and what they're supposed to do. It's called Buddy AR along common frontlet. AR is aerial refueling. Buddy is 2 of them side by side. Air Force nicknames that a drag race, refueling thing. Okay, and so you can actually go back, and if you had pilot training, you can recreate the exact route that they were supposed to fly. We don't know if they actually did, as the equipment was much more primitive at the time, and we don't know what the weather was in the Atlantic. Later on, interviews with the crew said that their altimeter showed them at a certain height, but they felt they were lower. So they could have just fallen into the ocean, we don't know.
So the other B-52 in flight and the KC-135 made it back fine.
They never reported trouble, the guy in the middle,
separated.
there were 3 of them,
Yeah.
and this was the northernmost, and the guy in the middle just said they disappeared, he looked over and they weren't there anymore. But I don't know how long they had been missing, because they were concentrating on flying their own aircraft.
They did more history on Millie Earhart than they did, it seems, to find this.
They did. Well, the Coast Guard gave it a shot. They launched what was then the largest search that had ever been out by the Coast Guard. 80 ships, several dozen aircraft.
That's the deep water.
This was their headquarters at the time on Lower Broadway in New York City. Anyone know what these things are?
Those are vacuum cleaners.
It was a network of 26 miles of pneumatic tubes. And
And there was no air conditioning.
no air conditioning. So this is Coast Guard headquarters. This was the search area, follow the track that I just pointed to. And they think it disappeared right about here, right before it was supposed to turn in and attack Philadelphia and Pittsburgh.
But you said that the results of all their search efforts is still classified.
No, here is actual issued by the Air Force. They waited, after a short time, they declared the airman to be missing, presumed dead.
Right, but one of your earlier slides said that it was still classified as what happened.
The results were classified until 1997.
Oh, 97, they released it.
5 years.
Ah, okay.
So the families were given this, and the men were lost, so they could collect their benefits, and officially no trace ever found. I've been in touch with some of the families, and actually the granddaughter of one of these airmen joining the Air Force or something.
So they didn't, I mean, there was no, this thing just went down, and there's no debris on the surface or anything.
That's what the Air Force said.
Oh.
So there are only suspicions. And here's one. During, not long after, literally the day after they were declared dead, a ship from East Germany, under Soviet control, radioed sent this teletype to the Coast Guard saying that they found a 20-man raft with the letters SJUFB, and that it was sinking and it appeared to be punctured by ice, and no trace of crew. SJUFB, it might mean SJAFB for Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, we don't know. But the Coast Guard never, and followed up on it, as far as they tell, never told the rest of the Air Force, and the families were never told as well. But we don't know if this is the exact raft from the thing. The way it floated, it could have been punctured at ice near the south of Newfoundland or the Flemish Cap area. At the time, historians say that B-52 would not have a 20-man raft on it. It would have individual rafts instead that were attached to their seats. But we don't know. But again, there was no follow-up. I've traced this. I actually found the ship in East Germany through records, but the records of what they did with the raft when they got there completely destroyed, as they did a lot. Before reunification, a lot of these records were destroyed. It was brought back to, I think, Woodstock. Air Force said, no, this was nearly 100% effective. No one else can report.
In time of war, the government and the press have customarily joined in an effort based largely on self-discipline to prevent unauthorized disclosures to the enemy. I refer first to the need for far greater public information, and second, to the need for far greater official secrecy. In times of clear and present danger, the courts have held that even the privileged rights of the First Amendment must yield to the public's need for national security. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. Nevertheless, every democracy recognizes the necessary restraints of national security. And the question remains whether those restraints need to be more strictly observed if we are to oppose this kind of attack as well as outright invasion.
So, public speech, the American Association of Newspaper Publishers at a hotel in Washington, and of course they were doing just the opposite, censor virtually any kind of reporting, but saying to the public, we're against censorship, we're fully transparent. At the same time, Kennedy had his brother, Attorney General, doing his absolute best to use the IRS and the FCC to close down conservative radio stations so they would not criticize him over the Bay of Pigs invasion. And so he asked the newspaper publishers to ask two questions. Not only is your story news, but is it in the interest of national security, as the White House defined it? What happened is two Vulcans from the British Royal Air Force had actually just slipped right through, along with many others. Someone in the British Air Force leaked that report, and then they trotted out the U.S. Secretary of the Air Force, who said, no, that didn't happen. Of course it had. And they'd gotten that easily. But why would the British leak that information?
Right.
Okay. Well, the answer is you got to follow the money. They had defense contractors in Britain and Canada that would make a lot of money by re-equipping the Vulcan as a strike bomber as opposed to a defensive deterrent bomber. They have a new Skybolt missile. And so their own pilot had easily outwitted the U.S. radars, the $1 trillion system, and they were bragging about it, leaked it, and people in the British government wanted that to happen. And so they said, it did happen. Of course, we cannot deny that it happened. Overall, we missed over 40% of the traffic altogether. Of those that did get through, more than half of those just continued on after first being detected, they were just lost. Flying really simple tactics that have been perfected in World War II. One of them was one aircraft flying directly behind the other. Radars couldn't see it at the time, or flying close enough together that it looked like only one aircraft. And to this day, it's hard to tell them apart, but easily, and the Vulcan bombers, cool with an aircraft, they just walked in. During Skyshield 3 in '62, we took hundreds of these trainers, T-33s, launched them to simulate what would happen if the airliners had to be grounded during an attack. And they timed how long it took. So this was our practice at the beginning of the time for the actual grounding in 2001.
Kick it in the fist.
So this was a typical photo of airliners forced to land in Newfoundland at the time. And I think Antoinette, our Zoom audience, has a personal experience with that. We'll turn back to you after this is over in just a minute, okay?
Okay.
This is typical. News report said that was the first time. The Air Force, this is during Skyshield, and they had to capture the idea that no aircraft were flying. And so this being Virginia, they staged a guy with a thistle in his mouth. That was to show that nothing's going on. So this is National Airport, General GA. This is the actual terminal with nothing moving. And this was National Airport on the 2 days after the attacks. And I went there and I had the airport to myself. I took these photos and it was making this guy really nervous. So this is the main entrance ramp to National Airport, completely deserted. I only found out just last year that at the same time I was here, that the airport historian was on the runway side taking the same kind of pictures as I was. So here's the terminals, and they just blocked it by putting wheelchair carts in front of the doors. This is the taxi area, it only has 300 or so, completely empty. And here I was at the Pentagon, and this photo ran on the front page of the magazine, and just landing in front of me, and they're just starting to bring in rigging equipment, and the fires are still burning. Every time there was debris, air would get at it, and then it would reignite. This is the commander of NORAD thanking the airlines for participating. Two things that are amazing parallels. 61 was on track to be the worst loss in airline history, lost so much money. Skyshield came along and said, oh, well, let's do it at Skyshield. And so they used that as leverage to get all kinds of concessions on regulation and new equipment and that kind of thing. 61, so it could be a record-setting year. 2001, identical, was going to be then the newest worst year in airline history. The attack came along and said, all our losses are due to the attack, pay out. So just in the first month, we committed to at least $15 billion in direct aid. And then each one that kicked off the long struggle with communism, and now we have long wars and everything. Where are today's threats? This is a Russian missile they call Satan, where the bombers at the time flew 200 to 300 knots, maybe 350 miles an hour. This one can fly, and the newest one up to Mach 27, which is more than 20,000 miles an hour. The one we're worried about might actually attack under the bottom. Remember I told you at the time was over the top. So we're relatively vulnerable by an attack over the Antarctic. Another threat is from the Chinese. This is a hypothetical track of a launch of a balloon that might release an electromagnetic pulse weapon to knock out our electronics. Just kind of wafting across the oceans in Alaska and Europe, and just taking his time going across the U.S. But luckily, this is hypothetical, or Commander-in-Chief would never order something like that to happen. Since the spring, NATO has been conducting a large exercise in Eastern Europe. It's the largest since Skyshield, but it's not even a fifth of the size. Tony, do you have a story about 9/11?
Well, I'd be happy to share if we have enough time.
Yeah,
Sure.
On September 11th of 2001, I boarded a flight at National Airport heading for my posting with the State Department in Guatemala. I think we boarded around 8 o'clock, and of course, everyone knows it was a beautiful morning. I think it was Tuesday morning, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky, and I was recording in my journal what a perfectly beautiful day it was to fly. And it was American Airlines, and we were in the air about an hour when the pilot came on and said in almost these exact words, "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? Due to a national emergency, all American Airlines have been ordered to land immediately. Attendants, we are proceeding to Miami National Airport and will land within 20 minutes. Please prepare for landing." And then the attendants, the stewardesses walked up and down in a hurry and got everyone buckled up. There wasn't any more information about why or what. And I was sitting on the window, and on the aisle next to me was a young man who was just looking stunned in the air. I later learned that he was an air traffic controller, and he was kind of beating his brain to try to figure out how this could possibly be. And he turned to me and he said, "Did he say all American Airlines or all American Airlines?" And I said, "Well, I thought maybe since it was a national emergency that it meant all American Airlines." And he just kept shaking his head, and he said, "I think there's a computer glitch." And because there wasn't any other means of information, we landed at Miami within that 20 minutes, and we taxied for what seemed like a couple of hours because every airline within a certain radius was converging on Miami Airport. So we had to taxi and wait a long distance from the terminal. And there weren't too many cell phones at the time, but the gentleman behind me had a cell phone, and he was speaking in Spanish with gasping at what he was hearing. And I turned to him and I asked him what he had learned, and he said the airlines had hit the Pentagon and the Twin Towers. And so then we waited a couple of hours, 2 to 3 maybe, on the tarmac. I lost track of time. And before we could taxi to the terminal, and there was an opening that we could come out. And the airport itself was flooded with people in a chaotic state. I looked over at the telephones, and they were all hanging on their cords off of the receivers. And we finally made it to the suitcases, and the suitcases were rolling off carousels like an avalanche of rocks. And there was no order to anything, and no one knew which airlines where suitcases could pick up or anything. So that was the story.
Thank you very much for sharing that.
from that side.
And to wrap up, notice if you're familiar with the Arlington, Virginia area, I have a talk coming up in the middle of June. I'm going to talk about the history of the Arlington Riverfront. And that's free. It's at Merrimack University, live or on Zoom. And I've got a couple of quick show and tells. This was an actual photocopy of what they gave out during Skyshield. This is just this is one airplane crew at one base. Repeated all over the country. There's 30 pages of codes, instructions, altitude remarks, calculations, even all the, every single page of every report marked secret. So hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pages, all kept secret and collected afterwards, and they remain secret for more than 35 years.
Everybody's garage.
You have questions, sir?
There are many layers of history in the presentation today. How do high school and university individuals react to content of the presentation?
I've only had, audiences that are largely adult, so I can't really say.
How would you speculate? How do you think high school kids would respond to elements of this presentation?
So I think they might shrug and say that was so long ago, who cares?
Yeah.
That's just speculation. Suzanne, you have a thought on that?
Well, I had a question about the Sky Shield. How did other countries react that weren't involved in it?
They participated, and for the most part, they played along with the official message on how effective the exercise had been. And we supported them in turn for their own exercises. And
What about like, did Russia do anything? Did, countries that were not involved at all, did they do anything?
there were, Russia held more atomic tests, especially hydrogen bomb, and accelerated after that. Like throughout the 60s, though, we're taking a larger turn to missiles. Thank you for coming. I'm not aware of anything that was directly responsive to Shield, but they increased their own plan. I know we're over time, so are we still?
We're still on, but it'll pick up soon in a
So
second.
thank you for staying. I know we're. Yes, sir.
I'd like to answer my own question, I think. I suspect that young people would find a lot of this as not very believable, or that, was America really like that? I don't think they can relate to how our country has changed in such a short period of time.
Well, most of them haven't been,
Well,
most of them
or
haven't
they
been
make
alive before 2000. So
Is that because they got the news from TikTok?
they grew up with
I
the
don't know.
cell phone.
Kids are a lot more afraid now.
They are?
Kids are very afraid.
Are they?
Yeah. I taught middle school and
What are they afraid of?
everything. They're so, because they get so much information, they're afraid of everything. Of getting attacked by
And the cynical-
whoever.
The cynical ones who say, the grandson of Skyshield protected Israel over the weekend.
Well, yeah, so I think I have to agree with you that the current high school generation would be more interested in this and understand the impact of it. It's a couple of generations before that may be more cynical about it all. But I do think it's important to remember that all of this activity goes on, nothing is perfect in this world. And all of this activity that went on back then, it led to the fact that there was this attack in Israel where, unless we're saying it's not true, that 99% of the drones and the bombs that came in from Iran were intercepted. So it takes time to build capabilities. And so I'm not as cynical about the message that is being portrayed that that the newspapers were misleading and everybody was colluding to make Americans believe. It does take time to build capabilities like this. And so I look at it as in a more positive light that, wow, it's come a long way. And I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on the capabilities that were demonstrated during those recent attacks. And yes, there'll be time to evaluate whether or not it was 99% effective, but on the most recent ones.
Well, the threats have come a long way too.
And the threats have come a long way too. And so all of this activity leads to the capabilities we have now. Wasn't perfect then, it's not perfect now. It'll never be perfect. So.
I'm skeptical of the 99% number, and I imagine that the reporting groups are skeptical as well. Nonetheless, the line, I pointed to posters from the Air Force and other groups in the 50s that said 70 to 75% of attacks will get through no matter what we do. But then later on, when we said, no, we never said that. It's actually 99% is safe.
Yeah, you would be hearing from people who were, or from areas that were actually impacted by a drone bomb or at some point. So.
I believe that there are more anecdotal reports that suggest it's higher than 1%.
Right, it very well could be, but it's still probably, it's a lot better than what it could have